and welcome to our second episode of Policy Pointers. Today we'll be talking about preseason preparation. I'm joined by three debaters from the class of 2024, Mahi Shah, Kevin Lai, and Devin Lai. Mahi was the top speaker of the Tournament of Champions and a finalist at the National Debate Coaches Association National Championships. Kevin and Devin Lai were both the 2024 Baker winners, recognizing their season-long excellence along with winning the NDCA National Championships. Before we get into the topic today, I wanted to ask kind of an icebreaker question and welcome y'all to the show. So my question is, what was the favorite file you've ever worked on?
I can go. I have an answer. Well, I have two answers. I think my two favorite files that some of them I've ever worked on are probably the consensus pick that I prepped for like my junior year TOC, and then probably honestly, I had a lot of fun prepping the cybernetics K file. Like it was so much fun to do. And I used it so much in the year, so.
Yeah, I remember both of those. Those were good.
What was the consensus pick?
Um, it ended up being red in like TOC semis. I think Sam and Alex read it TOC semis. Because I only hit K teams at the TOC, which was an experience, to say the least. But it was a pick out of like, you know how NATO, there was like, the 30 members and how everyone thought for a policy to go into action, everyone had to say yes. It like picked out of that mechanism and it only had a requirement of 10 members having to say yes. So it was a pick out of the mechanism. So I had a lot of fun with that.
That's really smart. My favorite file was also on the NATO topic. I really enjoyed cutting the Baltics off, and it was really fun to find those stupid news articles before every tournament that said that a Baltic war was imminent and that said that Russia was about to invade the Baltics, even though the Ukraine war had already started, and even though it would be starting a two-front war. So that was my favorite file.
Raleigh, thank you for having me on. I think my favorite file was on the fiscal redistribution topic. I liked cutting the negative income tax kind of plan. I think a lot of UBI apps didn't have a reason why that kind of plan couldn't solve.
You guys read that so much.
Yeah,
Last year's
I think
topic.
every
Yeah, that was
debate.
in like everyone in C.
Yeah.
All right. So I guess we can get into kind of the first question of the topic or of today's topic. But before we go into that, I just want to talk about kind of why it's important to think about preseason prep. So the season opener can be very chaotic and difficult to manage without adequate preseason prep, especially on a topic like intellectual property, because I think it's safe to say this year's topic will kind of lend itself to more new affirmatives and new arguments generally than most topics, just because of the weird aspects of intellectual property law. We had IP lawyer Wayne Tang and Northside coach on the podcast for an earlier episode, and he kind of talked about how affirmative teams can really choose any technology they want and just alter the IP rules for that. So what we want to focus on in today's episode is kind of two things. One, how to prepare for kind of negating those affirmatives, but also how to write those affirmatives in the most strategic way. So first I want to start on the negative approach to the topic. So for Devin and Mahi are twins, and Kevin also feel free to jump in. I guess what is your first step in preseason prep from the negative side?
There's a couple things I would do. I think this is also very dependent on like how many people you have cutting cards and how many people that are there that have the ability to make files as well, because this can look a lot differently. So I think me and Devin's approach is going to sound a little bit different. So I think it's important to know that you streamline it based off of like the school that you go to. But the first thing that I always did for like myself for pre-season prep is that I made a list of the most common AFs that were read at every camp. So I would like go look at, the Georgetown camp, the Michigan camp. I know Emory has a camp. I would look at those. I would make a list. And then I made a list of things that I read at camp and that I felt comfortable going for or was interested in, like based off of like what I, read at camp. But I also just thought about But normally the list of things that you read at camp and that you're interested in is a lot more than what you can actually prep for the season opener. So from there to like condense, I thought about the types of AFs that would be read. So for example, last year's topic, I knew that there were going to be tiny social security AFs, like the one that Lhasa read that for the first like the territories AF. I knew there would be big like jobs guarantee or like UBI AFs. And then I knew that there would be like big social security AFs. So I thought about my prep in the way that I was like, I need one like really good winning strategy to beat all of these AFs. And I think that condenses the amount of prep that you have to do significantly. Like you don't need to case snag, in my opinion, you don't need to case snag every single app that is on the topic. I think that if you have things you feel good about, like you'll be able to beat apps even if they're generic.
I largely agree with Mahi. I think the part where I slightly deviate with my preseason prep is Peninsula as a team and I individually, we always started with topicality. There, even after camp concluded, even after we knew some of the apps that were being read, we always went back to look at T to see if there were any more unexplored areas of the topic and also to figure out what exactly the bounds of the topic are. After that process, I think most of what we did followed Mahi's steps. We would look at apps commonly read at camp. But T was always really important because it not only informed what apps are topical, it also told us what counterplans are competitive. And we would always think about the research we did into T in informing what functional limits or what core generics we would cut for the topic. I think that Mahi's advice about categorizing apps was something that really impacted my senior year. It helped me be able to figure out what core generics I needed for the different categories of affirmatives. And I think it's advice that everyone should abide by every year in debate.
Yeah, and just to jump in real quick, with two things. The first is that the statistics for the IP topic from like the most popular camp apps at Michigan, e-commerce was 25% of the disclosure for the camp tournament, and the Patent Eligibility Restoration Act was 10%. So just as you're looking at kind of what apps to prepare for, it's probably worth writing a case connect to both of those. And I'll share like the full stat breakdown on our website along with the episode. And then at DDI, the most common affirmative was involved remedies for patent infringement. So kind of how injunctions work in the enforcement aspect of IP law. So both those are worth looking at. And then the second thing I wanted to say is that the other thing I value with T and that whenever I worked with like my 2N and what we value to T is that it's kind of like the most important weapon in your arsenal, especially when you aren't sure what the F or we aren't sure like how to negate the F. If you can get that violation and you can go for that core generic T interpretation, that can be really useful, especially at the opener. This year there probably isn't one great T interp, but there are some different angles you can take with about how the AF can strengthen protection. So it'd be worth investing in one of those and try and find a way of like visualizing what affirmatives violate that or not. And then kind of jumping off what Devin said about like informing what counterplans and what arguments are kind of mutually exclusive with affirmatives, I guess, how did y'all approach writing and like thinking about topic generics, whether that be like disads or counterplans? Yeah.
I think for me, it depended on the topic. Last year's topic was very, very good for disadvantages. Many apps had really radical shifts away from the status quo. The resolution kind of required it, unless you were a small social security app. And in those cases, and because of the way the resolution was written, our strategy centered around the status quo and going for disadvantages. We knew that basic income apps, job guarantee apps, big social security apps would always link to politics, elections, the economy disadvantage. So a lot of our negative strategy was centered around how to win a big risk of this disadvantage and how to get the case small. I know that a lot of times this could be a lot more card intensive because every team is ready to answer the disadvantage. But I also think that going for the status quo can often be easier than going for a counter plan because the world is pretty fine as we know it, and defense is a lot easier to win than defense against the app's advantages is a lot easier to win than in most cases a counter plan. I think on other topics, maybe this one, the NATO topic for sure, counter plans was something that I relied on a lot more as a crutch because the status quo was just indefensible. There were no disadvantages. And I think that in that scenario, I spent a lot more time looking at both topicality and also seeing what kind of plans are competitive. And that I think on this year's topic will inform a lot of negative strategy as well.
I agree largely with everything Devin said. I think that this year, particularly, or I guess this past year, when we were seniors debating, a lot of my preparation was also around disadvantages, just because I think camp is a pretty good indicator, maybe not of what people are going to read the entire season, but of what people are definitely interested in researching. Because I think most of the 2Ns, when I was kind of looking at camp at what they were reading, they read pretty much similar strategies throughout the year as well, even though there were some tweaks and like some new things that got thrown out there. I think for disadvantages, something that was really helpful is ILG mentioned this, but the sort of categorization of like, is this going to fit for like big AFs or is this going to fit for small AFs? Because I think for me, I realized that it's a lot easier to have a disadvantage that against big AFs because I was like, in the beginning of preseason prep, I knew similarly to Devin, I was like, okay, I want to be able to go for the econ disad. I want to be able to go for politics. And then it was more about finding something that fit like the smaller AFs that the link was a little bit iffy because there were times where you would read the disadvantage and yes, it linked to the AF, but the AF had a small link turn saying that, the entire link is not comprised of the entire link doesn't make sense because the AF is only about a small portion of the entire link itself. So I focused a lot on that. I think that for the NATO topic, and I think most topics, I think process counter plans also are useful to have because I think in the beginning of the topic, or like at least at the start, you don't exactly know what's going to be competitive or like what's going to be AF or neg ground. But process counter plans are something where there's debate about whether they're competitive or not, but they're always going to work against every single AF. Whereas like you don't know what deficits are going to look like for like the states counter plan or other counter plans that are not process counter plans. And I always thought, I agree with Devin. I thought it was a lot harder, honestly, to prep like good counter plans and plans on the neg on this topic as compared to disads.
Yeah, and just to jump in, I think two things that Mahi said are really important. One is kind of noting what apps people are interested in. So we talked earlier about like what camps like broadly what apps are interested in, but also I always like noted what specific teams were interested in. I think one funny story was my junior year. I remember one idea that Mahi Shah from Nutrier threw out in like a research meeting for our lab was like a shipping cybersecurity app. And he never actually read it, but I remember always thinking like Nutrier is going to break a shipping cybersecurity app. And like this is a bad example to give because they never actually read it, but sometimes it works and sometimes it's useful to think about like what teams are reading. And like another example is like we read jobs guarantee, like secular stagnation, like all throughout camp. And then that was our app for the entire first semester. So like I think, I mean, you probably could have predicted it. I mean, you never know, but like sometimes when you're like hitting a team and they say new and it's like the first round of the season, like you can probably guess like the general direction. And the second thing that kind of goes with that, and Mahi talked about this, is kind of thinking about like advantage themes. So like last year, a theme you would commonly see was like plan reduces inequality, inequality causes a bunch of different stuff, wars, like that kind of stuff, or like broad economy advantages about like resolving structural issues with it. So I guess like even if you don't have a case genetic to like the specific app, if you can kind of categorize like advantage themes and write defense to those, that's really useful. This year, I think the big advantage theme is like broad innovation stuff, like even not even just in patents, because like the 1AC says that we solve roadblocks to innovation generally, and like patent protection is important for that. If you can find ways to answer that and generate ground off that for the negative, that will be really helpful. So like whether that's like writing a patents bad file, writing like an innovation bad file, and getting a lot of like new impact defense cards. So like a lot of the typical impacts that will kind of help, even if they're writing like a new way of solving innovation every round, just because there are so many different like advocates on this topic. And then the next thing I do want to move into is kind of perennial generics. So less than like topic generics, less like the core distad, the core counterplan, or case turns. Perennial generics, I think, are like uh arguments you can read from topic to topic, even if the app deletes a topic generic. So Mahi mentioned process counterclaims, which I think are really helpful. The other ones that come to mind for me are like critiques, advantage counterplans, big impact defense files. If either of you want to jump in on this and talk about kind of like if you think those are useful to prepare for the opener, if they're like not useful, you can just use ones from the last year's. But yeah.
I think the capitalism critique is very good on this topic because affirmatives have to defend a concept of property that is very exclusive and says that someone who creates a work or comes up with an invention or writes something or invents something has the intellectual property to sell, redistribute, and just control this property. And so there are definitely reasons why that would be capitalist or neoliberal. And there's a lot of good cards, evidence, and analysis about why that would be bad. So that's a good critique. I think it's a really good functional limit because it forces the affirmative to have a IP key warrant and a reason why capitalism is good. And it can also be read against smaller affirmatives. So I think that it's a good critique to have in your toolbox.
Um, I was literally going to say the cap K. I think it's a very useful critique to have. I also think that just based off of last year, I'm not sure what this would look like on this topic. I mean, obviously, I was gonna say things that skew, like critiques that are smaller and skew prep or like skew time, like the death K or the extinction K that were read on last year's topic. I think those are useful to have just because there are circumstances where you have no idea what you're going to read against an affirmative, and it takes less preparation than putting together a comprehensive CapK file, because to read the CapK, teams are going to be fully ready for it because it is something that is read year to year. So they will have better answers than other critiques. So I would say look for those like small critiques that you can extend in maybe like 2 minutes if you need to. Um, I was also going to say I liked advantage counterplans a lot as well, just because I think that teams can get overwhelmed by advantage counterplans, especially if you read a lot of planks. And if they cannot answer every single plank, um, they it's hard for the affirmative team to like answer extensively. Even if they answer each plank, they'll say 2 words on it because they know they have to answer all the other off case positions that are being read. But the only reservation I have about advantage counterplans is that you do need a net benefit. And if it is against a smaller AF or if it's against an AF that you've never seen, it's hard to generate a disad like in a small amount of time, or a disad that'll be big enough. But if you think your advantage counterplan solves a lot of the AF, your disad does not need to be big. It just needs to have some external benefit that the affirmative does not have. So I think advantage counterplan file is always useful to have, especially because like you can, if you have an organized file, you can just pull out planks and then overwhelm a team.
Yeah, I was definitely overwhelmed a bunch of times with advantage counterplan, so it was definitely my weakness. But building off that, I did want to ask, so I think a lot of teams approach it differently, how they negate a new AF when they like open the 1AC. And so one question I got when I was asking people kind of what they wanted to hear from us on this episode is like, what is your process when you open up the 1AC and it's something you haven't really thought about before? Because the thing is, like, I don't have an answer because last year we were lucky enough to almost never negate a new app. I think maybe once, maybe twice, which is insane. But so I guess what were y'all's strategies to negating new? Yeah.
I can just talk a little bit about this topic. So, from anecdotally, from judging at Kentucky and just seeing the lay of the land, it seems like most of the affirmatives will be about patents. A lot of them will be about patent eligibility. So basically, something that was not patentable before, the plan will make patentable. For example, MBA at Kentucky read an affirmative about patenting genes and also another affirmative about patenting diagnostics. Um, so immediately, I feel like for a lot of these new apps, patents bad is a very powerful generic to read against them. The affirmative team will obviously say patents bad is generic. It is not about our specific affirmative and the reasons why patents are necessary for this particular technology or this particular invention. So I think from the negatives point of view, it's very important to have arguments that answer that particular argument. Like you need to have reasons why the patents bad stuff does apply, and their attempt to partition their affirmative from broad patents bad is wrong and backwards, and it's just a false attempt to no link an argument that obviously leaks. And then the second component is to just have an external reason why patents are bad. That's external to all of the innovation stuff and external to the impacts of the affirmative. So that's a very effective strategy against new affirmatives because you can just say there's this external impact that outweighs, it's separate, you can hang your hat on it. But this is also just a case turned to the case. Every single reason they say that the app promotes innovation, it straight turns every advantage because this is the reason why the affirmative is bad for all of these things they say are good. So that's a core generic, I think, can work effectively against new apps.
I guess, do you all have any tips on kind of like your method in like working with your partner and like constructing the one and C and like visualizing a two and R?
I do. Okay. This is something that I always did when we would hit a new ask is if okay, when you get the pairing and after they disclose new, what I would do is I would tell my partner Cyrus to put a toolbox together, or like we had a toolbox that we used, and he knew that I would always want certain neg positions in the one and C regardless of what they were going to read. Like I obviously there are exceptions, and sometimes those things that you want and that toolbox does not work for you, but most of the time there were about like 3 or 4 off case positions I told Cyrus, I was like, we need to put this in and we're going to have this in. And he knew that, so I didn't even have to tell him every time there was a new off because we had talked about it beforehand. So when the round would actually start and when we would get the 1AC, I would basically I would read through the app, we'd figure out what topic area it was, and we would just like talk about it because I think it's important, even if you're the 2N, to run it by your 1N just because there could be something that you're not thinking about, especially because you're the one who's going to give the 2NR. So you might be just kind of looking at things that you're good at and what things that might be useful, but you might be missing another element. I knew like Cyrus was very good at coming up with innovative things, um, especially against new apps, because I would always, gear towards, okay, like I know I'm good at this. I know I can go for this and give it to an R against it. He would always be like, yes, you're good at this, but also they might be worse at this and not expecting it. So let's add that. So we would spend a few minutes talking together, and then he would pull the off case that I told him that we already had crafted, and then I would craft whatever advantage counter plan I wanted or any other counter plan that I wanted to add that we didn't necessarily have fully prepped, but I knew based off of the app that I could read. So whether that was a couple of advantage counter plan planks, whether that was like a ban counter plan and add some sort of net benefit to it as well. That was always helpful. I think a lot of the time that in debates where you have the F, people generally know what they're going to go for in the block and the 2NR. But I do think it's okay when it's a new F to not know what the 2NR is going to be immediately, just because you might not even know what the F does. Like you will need cross-X, and you might even need 2 cross-X's to fully understand how the F, like, who does the F, how it works, like what the mechanism is. And I think that you're going to have to make tweaks and adapt because what you extend in the block and what you think is going to be the 2-1R, the 1AR will recontextualize when it's a new AF because that's why they're reading the new AF. They want to be able to skew whatever strategy you read. And it's okay if you have to kind of move around certain things and not just go with what the A strat was.
Yeah, you should always be ready for 2AC tricks because some of the best apps I've ever read, you don't really know like why they're good until like the 2AC. And the other thing I will add, before I'll let Devin talk a second about kind of his approach, is that I think, and coming from a 2A, this might sound a little arrogant, but I think it's useful to talk to your 2A sometimes because they have looked into this area of the topic because they've like thought about different app proposals. So like an example last year is we were neg versus neutral or new, which is the only one of 2 rounds we were neg versus new, and it wasn't even new because it was IP dividend. And so like I saw the 1AC, and then Sai like asked me a few questions about like how the AF worked because we had also written that AF, and I also like looked into it. So I think it's like useful to talk to your 2A for that reason too, but also just so they can like sometimes generate more creative strategies that you really might not feel comfortable going for in the 2-1R, but sometimes they might be helpful and just kind of pressuring the 2AC more. Because especially with new AFs, 2As are like notoriously bad at writing blocks for new AFs against like a lot of arguments. They just focus on generics. I know that because I'm bad at it. But yeah, but I'll let Devin talk a little bit about his approach to new AFs.
I agree with that a lot. I think you really need your partner in these new app debates. And one story I have is we debated Taipei. They broke new. It was a social security app that we've kind of seen before, but they had an issue with their plan text. It was like half a page long. It specified a lot of things. One of the things it specified was it changed the calculation for the social security benefits from the current method, I forgot the name, to a new method. We read a pic out of that. Kevin was the one who cut it during the debate, and that won us the debate. So I think that it's always helpful to ask your 2A for insights, and a lot of times they know best, even when you're negative. One thing I wanted to add about the approach to new app debating is that there should always be a clear division of labor prior to the debate so that the 8 minutes of the 1AC is not haphazard and is very organized. The way Kevin and I broke it down was I would be in charge of the off-case positions for the most part, and he would get me case defense. I think that that worked well for us because Kevin was really familiar with app construction. He knew how to break apart the affirmatives, and he also knew where all the impact defense was. And like Mahi, Kevin and I did have a toolbox of negative strategies we would read against new affirmatives. So that makes it a lot easier because you can just tilde in the positions you want in the 1NC. One other note I have about new apps is always take a look at the plan text. A lot of times, new apps, they just didn't vet the plan text enough, and it can get the app in a lot of trouble. This could potentially make agent counterplans competitive that shouldn't have been competitive, or some sort of pick competitive that should not have been competitive, like the Taipei example, and that could win you a new app debate. One last thing is the app, when they have a good new app, will have tricks, as Raleigh said. Usually, especially at higher levels of debate, teams break new apps against specific teams, knowing what the negative likes to go for. So the app is written to beat that strategy. The negative wants its own tricks. So this could be a new process kind of plan. It could also be something that is a disadvantage that is tricky to deal with. Maybe it's reverse politics. Maybe it's the
This is sounding way too specific right now.
Oh,
I
I'll
guess
tell a story if you want me to. I think it's useful. So this is a story of me versus Peninsula. And so we wrote this AF. This I think was my favorite AF I've ever written to answer the question earlier about like what favorite file. Because it linked turned election or it linked turned politics and elections technically, yeah, elections and the econ dissad because it basically decreased overall benefits given out. It just increased the scope. and it was somehow popular. The AF, partial disability insurance. And so instead of going for what I wanted them to go for, which is the core disides of the topic, because I thought we had a good angle versus them, they went for reverse elections with a sneaky, unique, not reverse elections. It was like it was sneaky. That's all you need to know. And so like that's a good example of how to like throw your opponents off guard because I was definitely thrown off guard there. But yeah. And
I feel
then the
like
other things that sorry, go ahead, Mahi.
no, go for it. Go for it. Sorry. I didn't mean to
I was
cut you
gonna
off.
move on, but I do go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say I feel like everyone has a little peninsula story with this.
Oh yeah, yeah.
They
Yeah, I
read the
have
Armenia app because they knew I wanted to go for like a process counter plan, and I did go for I almost went for the process counter plan, because you should just be
yeah.
aware that they're going to read an app to try to beat what you want to go for, and I was not aware of that at the time.
Yeah, we read Sovereign Wealth Fund versus you because for process deficits. But yeah. Um, yeah, so you should know that like the two A's you're debating and the one ACs are constructed against your particular like favorite arguments. The other things I did want to talk about, just to circle back real quick. So like those toolbox documents you'll have, I know like we use one too, but if you could kind of just lay out like what people should include in those, because I think some people do it differently. And I think it's useful for just for people to visualize like what they should be putting in those one and C documents.
My 1NC toolbox had everything, every off-case position that the 1NC could have. And I would organize it by argument type as well as categories of affirmatives.
That's basically how we did it as well.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Yeah, ours is pretty similar. We had like generic case defense for the topic at the bottom. Like last year we had like inequality defense, populism defense, like econ defense, that kind of stuff. But yeah, that's a good way of organizing it. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about is if there's anything you do in preseason prep for negating chaos, just to kind of change the theme of it. Besides just changing the words in your T files from like water topic to NATO topic to inequality topic, if there's anything else you think is useful.
This doesn't apply for like I mean, this applies for preseason prep, and I think you should do this in the preseason. I just didn't do it till later. I rewrote my T blocks before the TOC. Like I rewrote all of them, and I think that everyone should in the preseason, actually. I actually, now that I think about it, I definitely rewrote them in the preseason and then rewrote them again before the TOC. I think one, it builds understanding because I think there's a lot of I think when you start hitting like debating chaos, you think that there's a lot of arguments and that are very like diverse. But in my opinion, and I think what I've come to learn is that most arguments are actually pretty similar. There's only actually a range of maybe 4 to 5 different arguments. They're just titled different things. And they're titled different things to throw you off and make you think that your block doesn't apply. So let me give an example. Legal definitions, it has a lot of different names for it. So it's like the anagram decide, the word, like it's called legal. It can also be called legal definitions. It can also be called like the power of words. I've seen it. But again, that one is very based on rhetoric, right? So your block that is based off of like words or rhetoric will apply. I also think that the way I wrote a T file is I would always have similarly a toolbox at the top of the T file where arguments that I knew was going to be in every T2NC. For example, answering, like having my no subject formation block, having my switch side debate block, then having some of the common arguments like the fiat K, having like answers to like no impact to fairness or no internal link to fairness, things like that. And then you can streamline it as you go down and have more like nuanced responses based off of what the AF is. I do think it's a good idea to modularize your blocks. For example, having multiple overviews for like fairness, having, if you want to go for clash and fairness in the 2NC, having it, timed out and having multiple versions so can put both in and have enough time to get to everything else. I think we also, aside from T, we would try to we went for the cap K, like we had the cap K as well as cap good. I was very much someone who relied on T, and like I wanted T to be my 2-and-R whenever it could be. But I do think that, and something I probably would have changed as well, is that I think you should get good at 1K, whether it's the cap K versus KFs, whether it's something else, just because there are some debates where you're not going to be able to go for T because of like judge preference, or the other team is just knows you're going for T, so they will spend a lot of time on it, and it makes it very, very difficult to go for T. So I would say have 1K or like one impact turn. Um, I don't, yeah, it doesn't really matter what it is, but just have something you're good at.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. Devin, if you have anything else, feel free to jump in, but I do want to move on to app stuff just for time purposes.
I just want to add really quick that it's
Yeah.
also important, in addition to all of that, to have some defense of the topic and all of the key mechanisms of it. So you should have a reason why debates about patents are good, and you should be able to defend that to some capacity.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And then I do want to move into app stuff just for time purposes. So I guess flipping the question that I asked earlier, for Kevin, but Mahi and Devin also feel free to jump in. I guess what was your first step in preseason app preparation?
For me, I kind of just cut what I wanted to cut, and there wasn't really a formulaic process to it because I just wasn't that kind of guy. But I think it is important for the affirmative you want to read to have an angle. That angle can be no linking every time. I think that's the strategy Scott Wheeler, my coach, likes, which is having an affirmative that does not link to econ, does not link to patent SPAD or any of the other functional limits, and still has a robust series of advantages, but just can no link all of those arguments because then the negative has nothing to say. The past year, I opted for a different approach, which was to link to every single disadvantage. I read the degrowth affirmative, so every single reason why capitalism is good, every single reason why degrowth is bad, and every topic generic about the economy, about everything applied to our affirmative. But it still had an angle against every dissad because rather than no linking or link turning the disadvantages, we opted to impact turn the disadvantages. And sometimes those kinds of affirmatives have their uses as well because they allow the affirmative to get a lot more ground. There's a lot more add-ons they can say. It's more robust against counter plans because since it's so much more unpopular, say no becomes a much stronger deficit against process counterplans. And because it was so structural and large, it was hard for advantage counterplans or picks to capture all of the reasons why the whole affirmative was necessary to solve the affirmative. So it really just depends on what you want to do. But I think it is important to think about what you want your 2ARs to look like against these disadvantages, against these counterplans. Is it a no-link squirrely attempt approach, or is it robust impact turn or link turn or some other strategy you want to adopt against these strategies?
Yeah, I think that's really, really good advice. I think it honestly is just topic dependent, and like kind of 2A dependent. Because I know like last year, just like Kevin, I kind of like fell in love with the jobs guarantee app in the same way that he loved like degrowth. Like the authors just like they wrote so passionately that it just inspired me to read the app for the entire first semester, even though it was definitely a horrible idea, from the perspective of like growth. But I think like if you want to go that route where it's like the big app, people probably know about it because it's like so popular in the literature. You need to be ready for like answering all those disads because like yes, you will have good deficits versus counterplans because you have a good defense of like doing that huge policy, but you will also link a lot harder to a lot of core disadvantages. So you need to be ready for that. And then like this year, maybe I would say the topic lends itself more to smaller apps. So then you need to be thinking about how can I generate deficits versus a different way of like tweaking policy to encourage innovation in this like particular sector. Because you can't really leverage like the just sheer size of the affirmatives policy and answering deficits. The other thing that I did want to mention is kind of choosing between like cutting a new app from camp and reading a one that was already cut by camp. I think in no scenario should you ever pull up to like the season opener with the exact same 1AC. Like you should rethink the 1AC entirely. I read a starter packet app last year, but what I did not do was like use the exact same cards. Like I recut all the cards on the 1AC and thought like more I thought like very deeply about like which cards were important and like making the 1AC efficient. So if you want to read a camp aff, you should always like retool the 1AC. But I also think that new affs are really useful sometimes. And I know like on the NATO topic, like we took the opposite approach because we said new from camp. And so people like might have been more thrown off guard by that.
I don't think it's usually necessary. And like Raleigh, my affirmative was also a camp affirmative. And a lot of the cards, some of them I recut, some of them are actually the same ones from camp. I guess I was just kind of lazy in that regard. But I do agree with Raleigh that it's important to know your affirmative really well. Even if you're not recutting every card, you should read through every card and know what all of your authors say. And you should have quite a robust understanding of what you want to go for versus each core generic versus each decide and counter plan that you can think of.
Yeah, and I think like thinking about core generics is important. I always liked talking to like kind of the two-ins on the squad, and also thinking about like what people like to go for at camp and writing affirmatives. Because I would like invest more time into like writing blocks versus like the econ dissent, for example, last year. And so this year that you should kind of focus on like thinking about what negative strategies people went for at camp and like what the two-ins are probably innovating before the opener, just so you can write an affirmative that won't lose to whatever strategy they're writing. And I think another way you can kind of catch people off guard is choose a different topic area. So the past 3 years, maybe four. What was before? No, water was not a topic area topic. The past 3 years have had three topic areas, and each year there has been a popular one, a somewhat popular one, and a weird one that no one talks about but is strategic sometimes. And so I think like you should always try and write an aff in those smaller areas, even if you don't think it's going to be as good, just because there's a lot less prep that the neg will do for those areas, and they can sometimes have huge payoffs. So like this year, I'm gonna get this wrong. Trademarks are the smallest, I think. Yeah, because trademarks are the smallest. So like if you can find an app that deals with trademarks and has a real advantage ground, that could be pretty killer. Just because it will skew a lot of neg preparation. And then I did want to briefly talk about writing new affirmatives. I don't want to go too far into this just because for time purposes again, but also I think it's a huge discussion that might deserve its own episode. But I guess writing new affirmatives, my big tips are just kind of like cutting everything you find and not leaving the 1AC static. I think like a lot of times people will write the 1AC and then write the 2AC. Like those should not be different phases. You should always be writing both at the same time. Because like you're gonna find a better card for the 1AC to replace it, and you shouldn't be complacent to be like, oh, this is such a great 1AC, but it's not like an amazing 1AC. Like it can always be better. Kevin, if you have any like other thoughts about writing new apps, yeah.
I totally agree with that. So our approach throughout the season, we basically just read capitalism bad on the affirmative the whole year. But the thing is, it was never just one type of capitalism bad. It wasn't just degrowth. And the whole strategy behind our thinking was that we wanted to change and adapt the way we interacted with the core disadvantages that were being read against the affirmative. So halfway through the season, we switched to the socialism affirmative. And the reason why was because our thought process was that just because we're saying that capitalism is bad does not mean that we have to reject all concepts of growth and markets and the way economics works now. Those things can still exist. They're not mutually exclusive with a better way we can organize society. And so instead of having to impact turn every disadvantage, like saying hegemony was bad, saying that growth was bad, saying that innovation was bad, we could also opt to link turn these arguments by saying that market socialism or another way of organizing our economy and our society can be more effective at solving these issues. And the other thing we did was throughout the season, we continually cut add-ons and updates for new scenarios. A big core scenario add-on that we read towards the end of the season was about the Ukraine conflict. It was really stupid. And obviously the affirmative cannot solve not the Ukraine conflict, the Gaza conflict, but it won us many debates because usually we see capitalism bad as a slow structural impact. So a lot of fast disadvantages can outweigh. But we went for this as a even faster impact. It's still one of only two hot wars on the ground now. It's about to escalate imminently. And so the affirmative is even faster than the disadvantage. And so it turns a disadvantage before the disadvantage can turn the case. One last thing I want to say is another example, just not outside of Devin and I, Lawrence Free State, they won the TOC a few years back, and I'm pretty sure they read the same affirmative the whole year, the PTD affirmative. What they did was they cut updates to that affirmative all the time. There would be new advantages that they broke against teams at round robins at the TOC, including against one of our own Peninsula teams. And they won the TOC with that one affirmative. So while I think that it is very good and helpful to think about totally new affirmatives, and that's certainly something that teams should work on, at the same time, it can be equally as effective to just change up the affirmative, to change up its angles, to make it a complete 180 so that instead of impact turning this ads, you can link turn this ads. And that's another thing that teams should prioritize, focus on, and do research for as well.
Yeah, I think the big moral of that is just like always innovate, always be thinking about new ways to approach arguments. Like it is just, just so important. And then I did want to talk about Aff versus the K preseason prep for a second before we go into two last questions and then we'll wrap up. So Aff versus the K, the two things that I think you should think about, or the one thing you should think about is whether you want to permute the K or impact turn the K and talk about framework. So this can take the form of like permuting the K last year, we said like MMT, like we just reorganized the economy entirely. We even had inroads like ontology arguments, or you can impact turn the K on the NATO topic. We said Russia deterrence good with one of our affirmatives. And so that kind of like impact turns the K because the alternative can't solve Russia deterrence, and like the link and the K kind of prevents that. And then also baiting framework. So you should think about one of those two strategies and write your app based on that. I also think you should like rewrite the 1EC to answer K and like potentially include preempts. That's pretty useful. But just don't like read your policy 1EC in a K round. So I do want to jump into a Reddit post from a week ago that kind of asked some questions about preseason prep. So if any of you have any answers to this kind of post or like helping this debater prep, feel free to jump in. But I'll read it real quick. I come from a small school with 0 back files and no coach, and I have my first tournament of the year in like 4 weeks. I've picked and cut my affirmative and have 2 AC front lines to a fair amount of the core generics. I have some neg files, including case tags, but overall feel like I'm way behind on prep. Last year, I generally debated around the 3-3 back bracket, 2-4 if it was a particularly bad tournament, but I'm hoping to break at this next tournament. What steps should I be taking to achieve this goal? And so I know we've talked about a lot of these, a lot of tips, but I guess like contextualizing it to this case, what would your tips be for this debater?
I love this question, and I love that they're trying to perform their best as a team from a small school. I think that small schools can be very successful and have been very successful. Lawrence Free State, which I previously talked about, Monte Vista, and other teams, other small schools, Chaminade have been very successful on the national circuit as schools with only one team debating. And the way I think they're so successful is that they really hone in on a few arguments and they get really good at going for those few arguments. Lawrence Free State, their 1NCs always had T cessation on their water topic, the capitalism critique, business confidence, in addition to a few other core disadvantages and counterplans, like the state's counterplan. And I know that Chaminade and Monte Vista had similar approaches as well. So, for example, Monte Vista always read a soft left topic, affirmative on the education topic, and just got very good at doing impact framing and at critiquing disadvantages. So I think it's important to realize that debate is not won or lost by proliferating the most number of arguments and by reading every single argument under the sun, but instead focusing in on a few arguments that can be read against lots of different affirmatives or that can interact with lots of different negative positions and being really good at going for those few arguments. So that's what I would recommend for how to go from 3-3 debater to breaking at tournaments and then to winning at tournaments.
I don't have a lot to add. I like this question a lot too, because this is something that I thought about for a while as a junior and senior, and I think I was doing it wrong originally. And I agree a lot with Kevin about categorizing and how you really don't need that many things to win debates and be good at debate and be successful in debate. The only thing I would add aside from I just want to reiterate the point of like really categorize your like prep. I don't know what this year's topic in terms of like, I think that there will be big patent apps. I think there will be small patent apps. I think there will be some small trademarked apps. I think as long as you know that you have a strategy that you feel good about for each of those areas, I think you're set. And I don't think you should try to case nag everything. If you want to do more prep in that regard, I would say, well, something I did is that I gave speeches on everything that I wanted to go for. So it obviously wasn't a lot because I was also going for a limited set of files, but I gave speeches and I did mini debates with my partner to make sure I was totally confident and I could give a speech and that I would be able to execute it. I would do that. And then I would also, sometimes people do this, is that after you assess if you have any leftover time, after, creating your generics and figuring out what you're going to read, look at a couple teams. If you look at the teams that you think are better than you can pick a few. If you see any sort of common thing in terms of what they're reading, I would prep out that affirmative. I think after, like when I was prepping for tournaments, I would only do generics, but then if I had some leftover time, I would look at the teams that I knew were better than me or that I thought I wasn't just going to be able to beat with generics. And I would try to come up with something, even if it was like not new, at least something a little bit more innovative. But that's obviously if you have leftover time. You don't have to do that.
I want to add one more thing. The wiki and email chains will be your friend. Ask to be on email chains. Look at the wikis of the best teams. You don't have to cut all the cards yourself. A lot of times the cards these teams cut would work perfectly fine. Maybe write your own blocks, but use the wiki and use email chains.
Yeah, and the other thing I will add is that also use camp files. Camps cut a enormous amount of cards and enormous amount of files, and there are a lot of times there are gold mines in there that people don't really know about. So like for example, last year we wrote the Mexico AF to read against Lhasa at Cal. And that was from a camp file that most people thought wasn't, I mean, the best affirmative ever. But so we wrote that for that purpose. And so the next thing I want to get into real quick before we finish up this is, what do you do after the opener? What is your strategy?
I'll talk about the 2N angle just because I think Kevin can answer better than I can about the 2A angle. I think it's different what you do. I think as a 2N, I would look, well, one, I would first go through and try to find people's 2ACs to things that I liked going for, because there would be sometimes arguments that I didn't have answers for. So for example, if I was going for the econ desat and someone had a really good link turn, I would go and try to find that in a 2AC and then prep out an answer to that link turn. Because if I hit that team again and they're reading their same AF, chances are they're going to read that link turn and then you'll have answers. So that's the first thing I would do, is go through 2ACs and then update everything I'd already created. After that, I would look at and see what other 2Ns are reading. And based off of that, I would try to see if there was anything that another 2N was reading that was really good and that was worth prepping out. Or I would try to go through things that were being read to generate a new idea. And you don't always have to prep a new idea for the next tournament, but if I thought about a new idea, I wanted to have it for like a later tournament or a tournament that was of more importance to me. That's how I went about prep.
What I want to add for the affirmative is that one useful thought process thing to have in the back of your mind is that you should never lose to the same argument twice. You should never lose to the same argument twice. If you lose to an argument once, you should be cutting cards to beat that strategy so that you never lose to it again. We lost to the space colonization disadvantage at the Green Hill round robin to Nutria, but after that, we never lost to it again. And so it's important after a tournament to go through every single position you see in every single 1NC against your affirmative, against similar types of affirmatives, and also just against other teams as well. Generic process counterplans and disads that are read on the topic. Cut answers to every single one of these arguments. Or if you're not cutting answers, at least think about what you want the answer to be and what you want the 2ARs to be against each of those strategies. Obviously, it's not possible to never lose to the same argument twice, but I think that's the general philosophy affirmative teams should have. The higher level thing is, after you prepare and after you're ready for all of the positions that have been read on the topic, you should always still be thinking about the strategies that have not been read on a topic and the potential areas for innovation that the negative can have against your affirmative. So I'll give two examples for this. The first is for the socialism affirmative. I had envisioned, or I had predicted that a negative team will try to pick out of market socialism and argue for an alternative way of organizing our economy and our society. Nutria did this against us at the California Berkeley round robin, and they beat us because they had done the research to explain why a centrally planned economy would be better than a market socialist economy. And so it's important for the affirmative to cut answers to arguments that have not been read on the topic and to think about what those arguments are. So it was totally my fault and my lack of awareness, as well as my lack of locking inness for not cutting answers to those counter plans and those strategies. The second example I want to quickly say is Jordan D was our coach last year. He's a very successful former debater at the University of Kentucky, and he also went to Alpharetta. And when he coached Ishan Momin and partner, when Ishan Momin was a senior on the NATO topic, they had they read the drones affirmative. And what Jordan D did with Ishan was that after every single tournament and throughout the year, Jordan D would just randomly think of potential next strategies against the drones affirmative. I think one of them was the Turkey prolificad or something along those lines. And so Ishan had already cut answers to that position. And when NBA broke it against them at some round robin, Ishan was ready to beat the disadvantage, and he did beat the disadvantage. So that suggests how important it is for affirmative teams to always be thinking ahead, to always be preparing in advance for strategies that have never been read before. Sorry if that was really rambly, but I think that was how I approached affirmative strategy, and I think that's very important.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Kevin, Devin, and Mahi, and thank you all for listening. This concludes our second episode of the Policy Pointer series. Please reach out to us at policydebatecentral@gmail.com if you have any questions. See you next time.